Well, good afternoon, everyone. So glad to have you with us today. We still have a few folks coming into the room, but in order to keep us on time, we think we'll go ahead and get started, and we might have folks join us as we move through the seminar today. My name is Amy Johnson. I'm from Student Affairs here at UNC Chapel Hill, and we are so pleased to have you with us for our April 2024 Mental Health Seminar, which will focus on a community of care and the role of social support in mental health. As you all may well know, we launched an intentional campus-wide conversation in 2021 in response to our global mental health crisis, with a desire to help support our Carolina community through this time and give our faculty, staff, and students valuable tools to support themselves and each other. Through these roughly monthly conversations that we have about mental health during the academic year, and talking about mental health and well-being, I should be clear to say, they are led by a leader in our community who can help teach and guide us in a discussion. And we aim to build resilience, to encourage help-seeking behavior, and to reduce stigma around the critical issues related to our mental health and well-being. We recognize that one of our best assets in addressing and supporting our mental health is Carolina's culture of compassion and care, which we used as a foundation for creating our Heals Care Network, and I expect will be a key theme in our conversation today. At their core, colleges and universities are organizations built on relationships. We have relatively complex models of shared governance that require us to come together to negotiate how best to serve our teaching and learning, research, and service missions, and keep our complex and multifaceted operational and educational structures working effectively. And Carolina, particularly, is a place in which our relationships and shared identities as Tar Heels holds real meaning and power for us. This is something to be proud of and to lean into, as they can serve as a real source of strength for us in navigating the challenges we all experience on a daily basis. So today, guided by our expert facilitator, we'll explore the intersection between social connections and mental health and well-being, reflecting on how a sense of belonging can support resilience and how cultivating meaningful relationships can help reinforce a community of care. One of our goals for the seminar today is that you will learn or revisit some communication skills and tools to foster these meaningful relationships and to further explore the power of community and social networks to help us sustain mental health and well-being. We're so pleased to have you with us today, and in the tradition of our mental health seminars, we look forward to another robust and interactive session in which we'll listen and learn and tackle important questions about our well-being. Before I introduce our facilitator today, I have just a few key notes to help you navigate the seminar. First, the chat is enabled for participants to communicate with each other and with our production team. The Q&A feature is also enabled, and anonymous questions are allowed. Participants will be able to see all questions, including unanswered questions, and can upvote any of those that they would also like to see answered. Our facilitator will spend some dedicated time at the end of the program today answering questions. And because I know many of you may be joining us for our campus credit, we will have a QR code that will be shown at the end of the program today. So stay tuned for that. With that, I am so pleased to introduce Dr. Desiree Griffin, who is a teaching associate professor in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at Carolina, and she has been in her role approximately 12 years. She teaches courses in clinical psychology, mania and depression, clinical research, sports and performance psychology, psychopathology, and psychology and law. She is also a director of undergraduate advising for her department, supporting students through the registration process and the progress to degree path, as well as advising students regarding graduate school and careers. And I anticipate that is a topic that we might touch upon today. Dr. Griffin received her undergraduate degree and PhD from the University of Alabama in clinical psychology, and she joined UNC Chapel Hill after a residency at the Southern Virginia Mental Health Institute. In doing a little bit more research into her background, one of my favorite data points about Dr. Griffin is that she took a 35-day cross-country trip with her family, including her partner and 4 children, in a minivan. So beyond what we can learn from Dr. Griffin today about resilience and that trip in supporting mental health, perhaps she can answer some questions regarding her top stops for a cross-country trip for us. Desiree, we greatly appreciate your willingness to lead us today in this discussion and look forward to the conversation with you. And with that, I will hand over the Zoom room to you.
Thank you, Amy, so much. You found my trip, huh?
I did.
That was actually a very exciting thing that we did as a family. And we try to go every other year now. So I'm happy to take some questions about that at the end if y'all have that. But no, it was a wonderful thing that we did. So.
Fantastic. I'm taking notes now.
All right, everyone, it's so good to see you, and I am really excited to be here with you today. This is an area that I just have a lot of personal interest in exploring. I think there is so much to the role of social support and the importance of friendships. And so we're going to dive into that today. Before we dive in, I do want to kind of tell you a little bit about me. Amy hit up a couple of those things. So I am from Mobile, Alabama. This is my family. This was actually not on our 35-day road trip, but we this past summer took another 3-week road trip up to Michigan. So this was from that trip. So this is my family. I have 4 kids. My husband, Michael, he's also a clinical psychologist. In the context of what we're talking about today with building connections and really developing our social support, I thought you might find it interesting that as a kid, I was actually very shy and it was very hard for me to make friends. In fact, I got invited to go to space camp in Huntsville, Alabama, and I refused to go unless my cousin went with me because I was too scared to go by myself. So I've come a long way since then, but I do recognize how hard it can be sometimes to find support and to reach out to people when you are just by nature a little bit on the shy side and maybe a little bit more introverted. As Amy also pointed out, I did go to the University of Alabama, and I will say that a couple weeks ago, that was the most bittersweet UNC basketball game I've ever been a part of. So I was happy for Bama, but that joy was taken away from me just a lot because it had to be to UNC. So anyway, I'll just go and get that out in the open. But at Alabama, my background is in clinical psychology. So I got my undergraduate degree from there as well as my graduate degree. And because it was the best fit, my background's in clinical psychology, but my focus is in forensic psychology. And I've kind of expanded that now because my background is in clinical. So here at UNC, I do things like mania and depression, sports psychology, like looking at how different clinical disorders affect athletes and things like that. So once I graduated from the University of Alabama, I came and did my internship here at UNC, and I stayed at UNC. So I moved here in 2010. So even though I was born in Alabama and have roots to the University of Alabama, I am definitely a Tar Heel bred, and I love being here at this university. There are so many great things about this community that I do love. Here's some of my pictures with my family at different sporting events here at UNC. So I am very grateful to be here, and I love teaching here, and I can't think of any other place I would rather be. So I thought to tell you a little bit more about myself in the context of this presentation. I would tell you a little bit about my communities and how they are somewhat diverse and how they have different levels of engagement. So one of my communities that I am fairly involved in are with my children. Well, of course, there's my family. That's like my nuclear community. But then with my family, I try to get involved with their friends, with their activities. So right now I'm coaching 2 of my son's soccer teams. I also have a neighborhood group, and we've called ourselves the Yo Mamas for whatever it's worth. We enjoy it. It's our text chain, but we try to get together on a monthly basis. And we all have kids who go to the same school. Again, we're all in the same neighborhood, so there's just some community there. I also, before you get upset at me with the NC State, we also have a family in the neighborhood who we have just really connected with one-on-one. This family has children who are our kids' ages, so we do life together in a lot of ways. And one of the things we try is to do things with each other. And so they're an NC State family, we're a UNC family. So we try to respect each other's interests and join each other in those activities. So this is us at an NC State gymnastics meet. And Hadley was so excited. You'll notice she's the only one wearing the wolf ears, is the one that's not my daughter. So in a different vein, I'm also a mentor for the Johnston Scholars. And so this would not be the same type of community with like our family friends where we're doing everyday life together. But this is a community that I can maybe pour into in a different way. And so there's a group of scholars here at UNC, and we took a trip down to Miami, for example. We try to get monthly dinners. And that's a way for me to provide some advising, some mentoring. And that's a different type of community that you can have besides just like friendship and family. And then one final type of community that I wanted to highlight, we're a part of our church, and one type of group that we're really involved in is what we call our life group or our small group. And this is actually a small group. We just went to the mountains together about 3 weeks ago. And this is actually a group that we connected with 10 years ago. So we've been maintaining friendships for 10 years. We're not even in the same life group anymore. We're not at the same church anymore, but these friendships were so vital to our support system that we still stay in contact today, even though we're all at different churches and we're in different life groups. So I just wanted to kind of give you a sense of the different types of communities you can have before we even dive in. So the other thing I wanted to highlight was I'm going to be using Poll Everywhere today. And so I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Poll Everywhere, but if you are, if you want to kind of have it ready to go, like if you use the app on your phone, that would be helpful. It might speed things up just a little bit if you're ready to go. I just wanted to kind of give you that heads up. And my presenter name is Psych Life. You don't have to remember that. But when we get to Poll Everywhere questions, you can use the QR code to sign in, or you can enter that Psych Life. And you can also use a website if that's easier for you or if you don't have the app. To kind of check in on where we are before I kind of tell you what we're going to be talking about, I want to take 1 minute for everyone to look at these questions, just 4 questions, and try to answer them as honestly as you can. So I'm going to give you 1 minute and then I'll check back in with you. You don't have to put your answers in the chat. Just make note of what your answers are. We're actually going to come back to this in a little bit, but just make note of what your answers are and then we'll go on. All right, about 15 more seconds if you can wrap that up, and we're going to come back to it. So do make a note of what your answers are, just not in the chat or anything. Hold on to that. Okay, so this talk is about social support. However, to understand social support and some of its contextual factors, one of the things that we often talk about, especially these days, is less about the connection and the support and more about loneliness. So loneliness is not a new concept. This has been talked about in lots of different venues, lots of different people over, since the beginning of time, right? So Aristotle recognizing that friendship is one of the most indispensable things of our lives, and Taylor Swift recognizing that she herself feels lonely despite her popularity. She feels like a lonely millennial woman covered in cat hair, right? So we see loneliness just being an effervescent topic kind of all around us. And again, going back to the earliest of times, like going back, if you look at the Bible, it's not good that man should be alone. That goes back to Genesis. Our Surgeon General recognizing the importance of loneliness and its consequences decided to do a whole advisory on the topic of loneliness. And I'm actually drawing from a lot of their research for today's presentation about how impactful loneliness and how we can hopefully address it so that we can have more healing through social support. And then also Mother Teresa, recognizing how loneliness can be like a really hard experience for people. We have lots of psychologists who are studying loneliness and the impact of loneliness and the need for belonging. We also go back to, different people and how they experienced it. And Ruby Bridges was known for being the first to segregate her elementary school. And she commented, what bothered me most was the loneliness in school every day. And she is a strong civil rights activist, but at the time that was, I'm sure, a devastatingly hard experience for her. The Dalai Lama recognizes how important connection and people are, and that when you lose that spirit of cooperation and community, widespread loneliness sets in. So this concept of loneliness is not limited to one generation, to one population. It is something that we all experience as humans, and it goes back for as long as we can remember or document. So when we look at the impact of loneliness, these numbers probably don't surprise you. You might be surprised, but we see it. And a lot of this came out from the Surgeon General's report. More than 50% of people report being lonely, more than 50% of adults. And I've got an asterisk there because some populations are hit harder than others. So we actually see that young adults have the highest rate of loneliness of any kind of age group out there. They're upwards of 80% of people are reporting loneliness in that age group and in that demographic, so much so that this has been labeled an epidemic, which is why the Surgeon General's office kind of tackled this topic and wrote a whole advisory about how we can combat this from an individual level to a systemic level. And within those demographics, also marginalized groups tend to be quite a bit higher, closer to that 70% range, um, more so than 50%. Interestingly, in our statistics, again, maybe not a surprise, but since 2003, our time that we spend in person with friends has declined by 70%. And on the flip side of that, we've seen reports of loneliness increasing since well before the 2000s. Actually, since like the 70s, we've seen increases in loneliness over that time as well. Now, again, these numbers may not be that shocking to you, but they were pretty shocking to me that such a large percentage of our population is affected by loneliness. So when we talk about loneliness, what loneliness is it's not just being alone. Loneliness is more of a mental state, and it's your perception of isolation. It's your perception that you have inadequate or meaningful relationships. And so what do we mean by inadequate? Inadequate means that you have a perception that you don't have a need being met, or there's a discrepancy between what you would prefer to be happening versus your actual experience. And this is important because loneliness is different from solitude. So loneliness is more of something that happens to you, and it's your perception of what's happening to you. It's usually not by choice. You typically feel left out, you feel excluded possibly. Whereas solitude, that tends to have more positive connotations. This tends to be more of an active choice by someone. And we see that solitude is actually associated with things like creativity, more introspection, more contentment. And so solitude and loneliness aren't the same thing, even though they both involve being alone. So we're going to focus more on loneliness and maybe how to kind of combat loneliness. So to get us started, I just kind of gave you some numbers for loneliness, but what do you think are some of the worst outcomes of loneliness? I'm going to open this poll up and we'll take a few seconds to let you kind of get your answers in. But just if you had to hypothesize what the worst outcome was of experiencing loneliness, whether it's a personal outcome, a health outcome, a financial outcome, what do you think might be a worst case scenario for loneliness? We've got some answers coming in, but we'll give you maybe another 30 seconds to get your thoughts in so we can kind of look at what you're thinking might be a worst case scenario. All right, let's see what you all are chiming in with for what you think are worst case scenarios. Absolutely, depression is up there. It's one of the biggest things associated with loneliness. Hopelessness is oftentimes associated with depression too. And there is a sense of hopelessness that comes about when you don't feel like things are happening in the way that you want to. Suicide, we do see increased suicide rates, absolutely, as a result of loneliness. In fact, it's one of the biggest predictors of suicide and most consistent predictors of suicide. Internalizing your personal qualities. Yeah, you might begin internalizing perhaps some negative things about yourself, which that might also lead to depression. when you're lonely, there's almost this vicious cycle that when you feel lonely, it's going to make you be more inclined to withdraw, and it's going to maybe affect your social connections. You see a decrease in your social connections. Absolutely. So you're picking up on some of those mental health components, and we're going to explore some of that in looking at what some of these outcomes are of loneliness and how that impacts us both physically and mentally and financially as well. So, in looking at health outcomes of loneliness, this graphic was pulled from the Surgeon General's report. One of the kind of main findings or a highlight finding was that lacking social connection is as dangerous as smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day. That's what kind of impact it has on our physical health. That was something I was shocked by. I did not know that. And it's higher than physical inactivity, than obesity. And these are things that have been epidemics in the past. And so this has a higher rate of impacting our physical health than some of those things that we would immediately think, oh, that's terrible for your health. But do we have that same reaction to loneliness? Well, a couple other factors. There's increase in heart disease and stroke related to loneliness. We see an increased rate in dementia in loneliness or associated with loneliness. And it's one of the strongest predictors of suicide. We also see increases in inflammation, increases as high as when we have someone who has physical inactivity, which is also related to inflammation. And a lot of this is correlational data. And you might think, well, is it really the loneliness or is it something else? Like, is it because someone is depressed that they have these physical health outcomes? Because we know mood disorders and health go hand in hand. And there's been so much research now that the loneliness component of depression has been chiseled out as a very specific predictor above and beyond just more general depression. So loneliness is one of those kind of nuggets in there that explains why depression has the impact it does on our physical health. So we also see an increase in anxiety and depression. So when children feel lonely, that increases their risk of anxiety and depression, and that risk goes upwards of 9 years into becoming an adolescent and into their adult years. So even if they feel less lonely over time, some of that initial feelings of loneliness can carry into their adolescent and young adulthood as they're having increased risks for anxiety and depression. Other outcomes over here on the right are some things that came from the Beyond Differences summary, and this was run by several clinical psychologists. And looking specifically at education, we see that loneliness impacts our education. We're less likely to be involved in school. We're less likely to participate in class, more likely to drop out. So in fact, lack of social connection is cited as a prime reason for leaving a higher education program, and also not wanting to participate in school at lower levels as well. And then on the more work side of things, it's been cited as causing or leading to upwards of $154 billion in lost productivity. Again, some of that's going to be explained by depression, but within the depression, the loneliness is a part of it because people withdraw from the work environment. They're less inclined to want to engage and get involved in work projects and group projects. So a lot of money is lost as well because of our experience of loneliness. Now, to not be a Debbie Downer here, just to flip side, there's so many benefits of social connection as well. And this is what the Surgeon General meant by, although loneliness can really bring us down, connection can be a healer. And so we really want to focus on how social connection can improve our health and not just on how loneliness can bring it down. So some of the benefits here, you see them listed. There's a 50% increased odds of survival, like survival rates are higher when you have more social connections, reduced rate of hypertension. You have reduced odds of depression. And this was one study found that when you frequently confide in others, your risk for depression goes down. And that was especially true for people who had a history of trauma in their past. And so that's really a protective factor for some people who have a pretty big risk factor of trauma in their history. Typically, when you have a strong social support and more social connections, you have better coping outlets and more resources for coping. We see increased in civic engagement in government. So we're getting more voices in government when we have people who have more social connections. And then when loneliness is related to maybe more academic withdrawal, we see higher academic achievement in those who are better connected. So when we look at this idea of connection, we find that belonging really is a core drive of our human nature. And we have certain motivational drives, like one is reproduction, one is like seeking food, and one that's been identified is this sense of belonging and this need for belonging. So I'm going to go through some different theories for that social connection. Because my background is psychology, I'll be focusing on the psychological theories. I'm sure there are others out there, but these are the ones I'm most versed in. So we're going to start with probably the most prominent theory, and that is need for belonging. And this was put out by Baumeister and Leary, and they really highlighted that this is a need. And the reason we recognize it as a core need is because of several features of what belonging means to us and what it does to us. So this theory came out in 1995. So that's actually relatively recent, considering how long this need has likely been present. Again, going back to Aristotle's time, right? So what they're recognizing with this need for belonging is that loneliness is actually a response when our need for belonging is being unmet. So when we look at this need for belonging, again, what are some features that make it a core need of our human nature? One is that it's just pervasive. We have this desire to form and maintain significant relationships. That's a main part of who we are as people, and it's been pervasive over time. Like throughout history and from an evolutionary basis, it's been natural to kind of do life in villages and in small groups. You had more protection that way. You had more access to resources. And that's just been something that's driven our behavior through time. Also, when that need is not being met, one of the reasons we know it's probably a core drive is that when that need is not being met, we actually see distress and potentially pathology. That would be things like the health outcomes that we see, and depression, anxiety, and the mental health outcomes that we see. We also know it's probably this drive because we spend a lot of our cognitive effort thinking about relationships, thinking about people, whether it's good or bad, right? You might be thinking about how someone has hurt you, but you might also be thinking about that wonderful memory that you had of where you went on this trip with someone. So we spend a lot of our cognitive effort thinking about our relationships and worrying about it when we don't have them. We also spend a lot of our time working with people and trying to cultivate relationships. That one's maybe changing a little bit. We're going to talk about this in our talk a little bit later today. According to the people, according to Baumeister and Leary, the way to satisfy that need for belonging, since it is a need, how do we satisfy it? How do we meet it? Well, they identified two primary criteria, and one is you need frequent personal interactions. And not only do they need to be frequent, but they need to actually be good quality and be mutual, to where you're actually caring for each other and you're showing caring. Now, interestingly, this is not one of the two criteria, but they also said that there's a satiation point, and that most people only need a few close, really good best friend type relationships. And so when I say a few, I mean like 2 to 5. And then once you get beyond 5 really good close friends, we don't really see any extra benefits from having more really close friends, even though most people probably have or can hold up to 50 friends. We really can hold up to about 5 close friends and really maintain that deep level of connection. And then we also know that when you lose a close friend, we tend to end up replacing that somehow. Maybe not immediately, but we tend to recover best when we can form a new friendship and develop a deep mutual friendship with someone else. So those are some ways to satisfy that. So keep this in mind. We're actually going to come back to this when we talk about how to build deep connections. Another psychologist who had belonging and connection as part of their basic primary drives and motivations was Maslow. You might remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs if you've taken a Psych 101 class or an AP Psych class. And it's not the bottom part of the pyramid, so it's not what he would consider the most primal, foundational need, but it's up there, right? It's kind of like there in the middle. So it's perceived as a strong need. And what Maslow pointed out was it's not just that you need to feel loved, but you also need to love others, and you need to show that love toward others. And that was part of how you can meet that need and build that sense of connection. We also have the self-determination theory, and this will be the last one I talk about. Don't want to make it too much of a class for you. But with self-determination theory, this is a little bit removed from relatedness and connection. But what self-determination theory speaks to is that this explains how we make decisions and the ability to make those decisions on our own. And that as humans, we have a drive toward growth. However, the only way we're going to strive toward growth and reach that intrinsic motivation is if we have three needs that are met. And to achieve that growth, those three needs are autonomy, so an ability to make our own decisions, also having competence. Do we feel like we have the knowledge and the ability to make those decisions? But then finally, relatedness. What kind of connections do we have and support do we have to strive toward growth? So relatedness is a really important component to us driving toward that growth. And going back to Maslow's, that growth toward self-actualization, you've got to have that connection piece first. So you can see that need for belonging and relatedness is such a crucial part of who we are as humans, as well as how we drive to become better people, to grow as an individual. So we're going to assess our own social connection. So we're going to go back to that scale that I showed you at the beginning. And I wanted to show it to you before I started talking about it, so your answers weren't too influenced by what you may have heard. What we're going to do now is score it. So the way you're going to score this is you're going to go back and look at your answers. And so for the two questions that are starred, so that's number 1 and number 3, you're actually going to reverse code it. So if you circled 1 for number 1, so if you circled never for number 1, you're actually going to reverse score that and give yourself a score of 4. All right. And then on number 2, you're just going to give yourself the score of whatever number you circled or thought of. And then you're also going to reverse code number 3. So again, if you selected rarely for number 3, which is a 2, you would actually score yourself a 3. So take maybe 15 seconds to tally your score. And then I'm going to have us see where we land here in a second. So I'm going to let you look at this so you can tally your score, and then I'll throw up a poll for you to tell us what your score is. Okay, hopefully that's enough time. I'm going to move on over. And this is the type of poll where you can just, it's like a heat image. And so you can just click on the spot that most corresponds to your score. The lowest score you can get is a 4, and the highest score you can get is a 16. So tap down wherever your score falls. All right, we'll take 15 more seconds to let you get your answers in. All right, let's see where y'all fall with your answers. Okay, so we're kind of spread out all over the place here. So it's really nice to see that the highest score, and we only have a few of those, are in that 12 to 14 range, and that a lot of you feel like you're in that 5 to 10 range. That's a really reassuring number, especially given all the things we just talked about with loneliness and its potential negative outcomes. So let's look and see what these scores mean. So one thing to keep in mind is that there isn't a cutoff of like, oh, if you have this score or higher, you're lonely. If you have this score or lower, you're not lonely. That's not how this one works. It is just kind of meant to give you a sense of where you fall. Again, it's a 4-item measurement. However, this has been validated several times in its ability to kind of correlate with scores of loneliness that maybe come from longer questionnaires. So it does have a pretty good history of its validity and reliability. The average score is an 8.41. So if we go back and look at your scores, that's probably about what the average is for this group, if I just had to eyeball it really quickly, right? So the average score for most people is 8.41, and the standard deviation is 2.55, which means approximately most scores are probably going to fall in that 6 to 11 range probably. And when we are trying to figure out what might be a telltale sign that someone is on the higher end of feeling lonely, a lot of people recommend using 14 as a score to kind of catch our attention. Doesn't mean that there's anything that, again, it's not like 14 is a score that says you're lonely, but it does indicate that you're 2 standard deviations over the average. And in clinical psychology and in a lot of clinical situations, we use 2 standard deviations. So when your score is more than 2 standard deviations away from the average, you're typically in a more extreme category. So you're like in the top 95th percentile, which means that you're reporting more loneliness than 95% of people. So that's an indication that loneliness might be something that is on your mind and is something that is more prevalent in your life right now. So just keep that in mind, and maybe what we can do and move forward is there might be some things in here that can help you maybe lower that score closer to the average. So if being with connection and having people is such a big drive, and feeling like you belong is such a big drive, why is it so hard? Now, again, your scores were in the average range, but they weren't way down at the bottom end. So why is it that if this is a core drive for us, and I'm trying to unlock it for you, but oh, there we go. Oh, I may have just locked it back. Sorry, I'm working on two screens. If I distract my attention, it's going to the second screen. But why is it then, is it so difficult to form these friendships if it's a natural human drive for us to find these connections? What makes it so hard? Because these typical motivations shouldn't be that hard, right? We have motivation for food, we go get food. We have motivation for safety, we get inside a shelter if at all possible, or we try our best to have the means to afford a shelter. There's no right answer to this, by the way. Just wanted to get your opinions. Take about 15 more seconds and then we'll see what y'all have come up with. All right. Absolutely. Fear of judgment, what other people are going to think of us if we try to make that connection with other people. Anxiety. I told you how I was a shy child, and that definitely interfered with my ability to get out there and make friends. Like the need for belonging didn't overcome my need for safety with anxiety. So sometimes the need for safety can overpower other needs, right? Social anxiety, absolutely. Fear of not being accepted, that's pretty common, right? So lots of fears and anxieties really seem to be the driving feature of what that kind of goes against our need for belonging. And I don't know if it's always been that hard for society, or if this is something that's more recent as we've gone through periods where we've had more disconnection. For example, like with more technology in the digital age, we kind of have a more our new norm for how we interact is very different. So something that is different from that might be very anxiety arousing. Absolutely. Busyness is a big one. So you guys are hitting up on a lot of the ones I'm going to talk about. So one of the things I was going to highlight is, and why it's so hard is, there is a book called Made for People by Justin Earley that I really like. And I thought the way he described it was really powerful. He gave the analogy of loneliness is a current. And when you're in a current, you naturally drift. It doesn't take any action on your part to get to a new destination. You just are in a current and it will take you there. And he was saying that our modern society really creates this current or this drift toward loneliness, and it's going to happen naturally. So if you do nothing, you will drift toward loneliness. And so whereas social connection is a human drive, we get caught up in this current that makes it harder to kind of follow that drive, and we drift. So we do have to be more active. And so some of those features of modern society that kind of drift us in this current are going to be technology, which is one of the things you mentioned. I'm going to break these down. Our tendency to not want to get in conflict, to avoid conflict. And typically when you have connections with people, conflict arises. That's natural about relationships. But if you want to avoid that conflict, it makes sense that you might avoid people. Busyness, our tendency to just engage in so many activities takes away time from engaging with others. Selfishness and independence. I know the word selfish is maybe hard to hear, but sometimes it is selfish motivated behaviors that drive our behaviors as opposed to community focused behaviors or a more independent oriented community. And fear of rejection. So you really identified a lot of these. So I'm going to break these down. When it comes to technology and social media, again, from that Made for People book, the way that Justin Early put it was he thinks of technology and the community we get from technology as being social media snacking. So when you have a snack, it fulfills something temporarily. It gives you that slight boost of energy, that slight, dopamine boost, right? But really, in the end, it's a false sense of feeling full. A snack is not meant to provide your full nourishment. That's what you have meals for. And that's what he would say social connection is via social media, is that it really is what we call connected isolation, that you're connected, you get a sense of social connection, and there's a time and place for it. Like there's a time and place for snacks. Snacks serve a purpose. Snacks keep us going. Snacks are a way to kind of get us between our meals, right? But it also is not providing us with full nourishment. And so with social media, this provides us with a sense of connected isolation. And I know this is not a new topic for a lot of us. And so I hope what I'm saying is not that far off, but from what you were expecting, and it was in your answer. So I would assume you're kind of prepared to see that. One of the thing in the Surgeon General's comment, and this is over on the left, is that 1 in 3 adults, so people who are older than 18, report that they were online almost constantly. And so when you're online almost constantly, that's going to decrease the quality of the interactions that you can have with people in person. One thing that it's going to do is that it can monopolize your attention. If you're always online, it's monopolizing your attention to do other things with other people. Oftentimes when we have our phones are a really big culprit of being a distraction to us. So a lot of times we just have our phones there, even if we're having a face-to-face conversation, our phones are right here beside us on the dinner table, on our desk, in our lap while we're in class possibly. And it can be distractions, it can be interruptions. And so instead of taking the time to talk to a classmate next to you or your office mate, one office over, who shares a cubicle with you, you're going to be on your phone. So it can be a distraction or an interruption. It also limits our in-person contact because we defer to contact on our phone, which is less scary. It's easier, especially if we are one who is shy or has more social anxiety, or if it just feels like work to have a conversation. And then interestingly, or not interesting, it probably shouldn't be that of a surprise, is that when you do have in-person contact, there's been an increased report of less enjoyment of those interactions because of the distractions and the interruptions that social media and technology pose. Another reason that this kind of drifts us toward loneliness is oftentimes there can be a lot of miscommunication via a text, and you withdraw very quickly. You don't actually take the time to engage if you're communicating via text. We spend a lot of our time, our alone time or our relaxation time, in front of a screen. So it was written in another book called Find Your People, very close to Made for People. But in Find Your People, they talked about how we used to sit around fires and talk over campfires or talk over backyard fire pits. And now we tend to spend our time relaxing alone in front of a TV, right? So technology has certainly affected the way we spend our time. And technology and social media is not always a bad thing. We've had several periods of time where we've had changes in technology that has significantly impacted how we've interacted with the people around us. Going, industrial revolution, the printing press, like that's all affected how we interact. So the technology in and of itself is not bad. It's just how we use it and how it might be impacting that need for belonging. Another one is conflict avoidance that we brought up a second ago. So this is one of the quotes: modern friendships last only until the first conflict. So in this day and age, there's not a lot of room for conflict. People don't have a lot of bandwidth or desire to engage in conflict, partly because there's this misconception that conflict is inherently bad. Conflict is not bad. Conflict can actually grow us. It can bring us closer together with other people. Now, some conflict can be something that ends a friendship, but it doesn't have to be, especially if you have a strong bond already formed and you don't quit that friendship, right? Because now oftentimes it is easier to avoid that conflict than to just fight for the friendship, because we do a lot of conflict over text messaging. And so it's easier to drift away from that or to ghost the person you're texting as opposed to actually have the conversation. It's also easier to get away because you can post anonymously and there's not many consequences to that conflict if you do have it. So busyness, this should be something that we all are familiar with. Just think about when someone asks, "Oh, how are you?" Most people say, "Oh, good, just busy," or "Oh, just so busy." That's our common answer when people ask how we are. It's not about how we're feeling. It's not about how we're doing. It's about the act of being busy. That's how we respond to people. And oftentimes, friendship is something that does not get scheduled. It doesn't get scheduled. And so, since it doesn't get scheduled, it doesn't happen. We expect it to happen when it's convenient for us or that it's naturally going to happen. However, as I just pointed out, we naturally drift toward loneliness. We don't naturally drift toward people anymore. That's something we have to work on. So it doesn't just happen. And since there's never a time that's convenient because we're always busy, friendship oftentimes falls at the wayside compared to other things in our life, like work or things that have deadlines that we do put into our calendar. A lot of us find it hard to be in solitude. So if we don't drift, if we're drifting toward loneliness, we also kind of drift toward distraction because we don't want to necessarily be alone. So we might drift toward distractions. And that is what we spend our time being busy on. In fact, a Department of Labor survey in 2015 found that people underestimated and overestimated how they spent their time. They tended to, so their perceived perception of free time and their reality free time was very different. They perceived that they had a lot more productive work and they underreported how much free time they had. And when we did look, or when they did look at their free time, they found that that the average person spent 41 minutes a day socializing. And that was 1/3 of the amount of time they spent watching TV. So the free time is there, but we don't naturally drift toward friendships. We're naturally drifting toward technology, being alone, things like that. All right, selfishness and independence is another one of those currents that kind of contributes to the current of loneliness. This is just different things that we might do that kind of show our focus on our own needs versus the needs of our community. So we tend to move for jobs, not people. If you're going to move to a different community, it's because of something that you need or your family needs. Perhaps you're trying to get to a different school system for your kids, or you're trying to maybe go to a certain school, or you got a job somewhere. We don't typically move for people. Sometimes people move back to be with family, and that's a really big social support for people. That's an effort to make a connection with family. Another good example of how we're very independent, instead of going next door to our neighbor to see if they happen to have a book that we can borrow, we just buy it on Amazon because that's quicker, that's easier. It allows us to take care of it right away. We don't have to interact with anybody that way. We'd rather pay someone to help us with an act like with something than ask for help. Instead of asking someone to maybe help take care of your lawn while you're gone for a week, you're just going to pay somebody to do it, right? Because it's just easier, it's faster. You don't want to put a burden on anyone that way. And it's also just your way of maintaining some independence. We don't have a lot of shared purposes anymore. A lot of things that gave people shared purposes, like different organizations, different volunteer groups, they're dwindling. They're still there. They're still there to join, but they're not as common as they used to be. Like bowling groups, like there was a book called Bowling Alone, where people used to meet together in bowling groups. And that's just not something people do anymore. They don't have those kind of shared activities and shared purposes. Instead, people drift toward individual success. Like they're aiming toward what's going to make me successful and what's going to achieve my goals. We also tend to be fairly egocentric about our needs. We tend to prioritize our own needs and don't think about other people's needs before our own. There's also that fear of rejection, and this is something you all pointed out in the poll. And we have an instinct to hide. We want to hide the bad things about ourselves, or the things that we perceive to be the bad things about ourselves, the shame, trauma, pain, fear. Those are all things that we don't want to share with other people. And so we tend to close ourselves off and keep things very superficial, which decreases our chances of building connection. We don't want to be vulnerable. We don't want to be called out. When we do share, it tends to be much more superficial, just pretty pictures of vacations we took, only the happy points, not the things that really are hurting us that we might need support to get through. And there's definitely a fear of failure. I think our current generations have a harder time experiencing failure and feeling like and kind of catastrophizing what that failure might mean. And so if you have a failure and when you try to reach out to someone, that can be very overwhelmingly sad, and it might shut down your future attempts at building connections. All right, so this is a rank order. Which of these currents do you think is strongest for you? Like, which one of these do you think is the strongest current keeping you away from building connections? And you can drag them, so you can click on it and then drag it. So rank order it, like which one do you think is strongest for you versus which one do you not, or you're not as, bothered by or pulled by, I should say. All right, take about 15 more seconds to rank order those so we can see what seems to be the strongest currents for the people who are here today. Fear of rejection. So that's a really big one. Like there is just that really embedded anxiety and fear. And some of that is likely coming from our recent COVID pandemic, where it really made it hard to connect and we're kind of having to relearn those skills. So part of that fear of rejection can possibly be countered with building social skills. But we'll talk about ways to counter that. Busyness. Yes, busyness, that is so prominent in our culture today. And it certainly does get in the way of really building quality friendships. So, all right, thank y'all for responding to that. And we're going to look at different ways you can actually go against the current, right? What can you do that's going to help you fight the current and the drift toward loneliness? So we can see, we need to seek deep connection, but how can we do that? How can we go against the current to do that? So I've tried to kind of categorize different things that you can do to seek out deep connection. I've tried to put them into different categories. And so I've put them as like being proactive, committing time, going deep, engaging in service, and honoring your values are things that I think are kind of prevalent across multiple research studies that we've looked at as to how to really build that deep connection. So in terms of being proactive, I also, just so you know, before I did this talk, I surveyed about 200 students. So I didn't get any faculty or staff in this survey, but in the students, I asked them what did they find to be the most beneficial thing for helping them feel connected on campus. And so a lot of their answers really kind of fell into this proactive category. So a lot of people said they talked to as many people as they could. They forced themselves to go to a game or different UNC sporting events. They asked people to go get food, and they created study groups. So you can see that those answers, again, it's just a representation of what a lot of them were, but they highlight how they're taking ownership of their behavior. They're not waiting for things to happen. So you have to make the first move often if you want to start building deep connections, because again, we drift toward loneliness. And if you know that you need to make the first move, you might be the only one in your social circle who knows that if anything's going to happen, someone has to be proactive and make it happen, because it doesn't happen by itself, right? So here's my quote from that Made for People book: loneliness is where we arrive when we do nothing else. So you have to do something. And so you might as well be the one to make the first move. When you're being proactive, when you're building connections, be proactive in building your social portfolio. You don't have to be best friends with everyone, but remember that saturation point, it's about 50 friends. And within those 50 friends, try to diversify your portfolio. Get friends in different settings. Have your connections be through different outlets, whether it be school, whether it be clubs, maybe it's your neighbors, it's through work, church, organizations, whatever it is. You want to diversify the settings of those friends that you start developing. So when you are proactive, be intentional in selecting friends from different outlets. Also try to have different types of friends, right? Not everyone has to be that close friend. Different people serve different purposes. Acquaintances kind of serve a purpose of having someone who's readily available if you need them, but you may not go to them for your deepest needs. But it just provides that sense of belonging to a community. When you're acquainted with lots of people in different settings, you feel like you belong more to those communities. Coworkers and classmates and mentors, they can have a utilitarian purpose. You might be able to work on projects together. You might be able to get advice from people who are in those settings. And that's a different type of connection than a close friend who you're going to be really vulnerable with and share like your true self with. You've also got to make yourself available. In being proactive, you need to proactively be available. So when you are at work, or when you're going to campus or when you're going to class across campus, don't put your AirPods in, or don't be on your phone. Like, put your phone away, take your earphones out, and be available to either strike up a conversation with someone, or while you're in class waiting for class to start, if you've got your AirPods in and you're looking at your phone, people probably aren't going to be as inclined to talk to you, which that might be your whole purpose, because you don't want anybody to talk to you, right? But you'll find that most people don't mind a little conversation. And one of the things that people said that where they found their friends were in classes. They started talking to people in their classes. Now, again, are those their closest friends? No, but you don't know unless you make yourself available and you make that first move. As you're walking across campus, smile at people, right? It can kind of help you feel more belonging on campus, and it can increase their sense of belonging as well. Also, be on campus. Like between classes, don't go back to your apartment, or if you're at work, if you have the option to work in the office or remotely, maybe take advantage of working in the office more days than you've been doing that, right? Obviously, a remote schedule can be very convenient, but maybe try to get the benefits of both, the flexibility of remote, but the connection of being on campus. So yeah, be on campus or be around people when possible. A very common response that most students gave in that survey was one of the things that helped them feel most connected at UNC was joining a club or an organization. So that's obviously something you can do that requires you to be proactive. A couple of people even identified that you don't want to just join a club. You actually want to commit to it and show up and go to the meetings and then make an effort to get to know the people in the club. So you can't just join. You kind of got to make that extra step to really get involved. Go to different social events, try out different activities. So these are all things you can do to be proactive. Again, sometimes easier said than done. And you're probably thinking, well, yeah, this makes sense, but it's not always done. And so why do we not do it? Partly for that fear of rejection. But if you know everyone has that fear of rejection, or it's pretty common, maybe it won't feel as uncomfortable. All right, so time. Busyness was the second one that you all picked as a big deterrent to why you might get involved. So a quick question for you. How long do you think it takes most students to feel connected at UNC? Again, this was a survey I did with students, so I only have it for students, but how long do you think it takes students to feel connected at UNC? We'll go kind of quick on this one. All right, about 10 more seconds. All right, 2 semesters. Y'all are spot on in that 1 semester, 2 semesters. So great. I'm glad you are aware that it takes time, right? It doesn't take a small amount of time. When I asked this question, there was one person who said one day. They felt connected in one day. They were the only one who said that out of 200. Like one person put 2 years, and they're the only one who put 2 years. Most students said anywhere from 1 to 2 semesters is how long it took them to feel connected at UNC. So how much time do you think it takes to become good friends? There have actually been studies that have documented the amount of hours it takes to move from being an acquaintance to a good friend to a best friend. So to kind of get to that middle ground, good friend, how many hours do you think it takes? All right, 10 more seconds. All right, a lot of you are saying, got that covered up, right there at 50 hours. And you are, yeah, you're about right. So, well, actually, not quite. I'm thinking casual friends. So to go kind of in that acquaintance to casual friends, so not good friend, the study where they followed college students around campus, it took 30 to 50 hours to go from just an acquaintance, like you meet someone, to being a friend, like a casual friend. It took 90 to 140 hours to fall into that good friend category, and it took 300 hours to get to that best friend category. So this is a lot of time. And I think people underestimate how much time it takes to be a good friend. And so when we talk about how are we going to go against the current, you have to be intentional with your time. So again, students, when they said, what did they do to feel connected? Some of them did highlight the time they took. So I spent time getting to know my suite mates, nightly dinners with my suite mates. So one of the things you can do with your time is to create a consistent rhythm. If it's part of your schedule, a part of your consistent schedule, you're more likely to build it in. So maybe just go ahead and at the outset, schedule a weekly lunch with a coworker, schedule a weekly lunch with a friend, go on a daily walk with your roommate, schedule a monthly dinner with your kind of close group of friends. I'm actually going on our monthly dinner with my Yo Mamas group tonight, right? And we scheduled it a month ago. Like when we have it, we schedule it for the next month. We go ahead and put it on the calendar. Do it, like have a weekly check-in. Maybe on Sunday nights you call your mom, right? Or maybe you have that weekly check-in with someone, but it needs to be something that's part of the rhythm of your life. It also needs to be frequent. So going back to our theories of connection, you need frequent contact with your connections for them to stick and to actually be meaningful to you and to meet that need of feeling like you belong. And again, schedule it. And if you do schedule it, don't cancel it. A lot of us, as we get closer to an event that we're scheduled to go on, we find excuses or reasons to not go. We're too tired. That fear kind of steps in. But go. Most people, when they're done, feel better after going. So just trust that it's going to feel good after you go. Think about proximity. Think you're more likely to see people and hang out with people that you live close to or have close connection to physically. So think about geographic proximity when you're trying to like kind of curate your friendship groups. Think about that. For example, we changed churches because our church was like 20 minutes away from where we lived, and it was harder to maintain those connections. And so we wanted to live closer to we wanted to go to church closer to where we live so that we could have more of those connections as part of our daily life. All right, depth. This is probably the most important one, in my opinion, especially for building deeper connections. And in terms of depth, again, we see this in the students' responses of how they felt connected at UNC. They found and had a core group of friends, and they got to know people on a more personal level. So I really like that quote, to be fully loved requires being fully known. And this is really what's going to be hard for those of us who put that fear of rejection as our biggest barrier. You have to be vulnerable and you have to be honest with your friends who are going to be in that close friend category. Do you have to be vulnerable with everyone? No, you don't have to be vulnerable with your classmate who you just met 3 days ago. But if you want to deepen your connections and have those more meaningful connections, you really have to dig deeper and be vulnerable. You can be vulnerable by asking for help, asking for advice, not having so much independence. You can fight that current of independence. When you ask for help, when you share your emotions, when you share your struggles, your things that you're going through, that builds intimacy between the friendship. And usually the friend feels honored when you are coming to them in that time of need. Make space to talk. Oftentimes, especially college students, we're really good at doing activities, but in your activities, build time to talk. Ask good questions. As a clinical psychologist, I know that asking good questions is one of the best ways to make people feel connected to you and to feel like you truly are invested in learning about who they are. And that curiosity, again, also sparks intimacy. You want to be a good listener too. You really need to listen to what your friends are saying and not think about what it is you solely need, but listen to what they're doing. Make space for one-on-one interactions, because when you're in groups, it's hard to really go in deep with someone. Also, remove those distractions. Like when you're having dinner with someone, just put the phone nowhere near the dinner table. That way you're not tempted to look at the text messages that come through when you're trying to have that deeper conversation. Also, schedule time before your next appointment. So you're not like trying to rush a conversation to get to your next appointment or to get to your next class or to get to another person that you're trying to hang out with. And then when at all possible, try to call versus texting. That's going to lead to more in-depth conversations. Also in the depth category, you really, again, and to go against that current of avoiding conflict, you really need to practice forgiveness. And this is hard. Some of the things that might help you practice forgiveness is if you assume the best. If this is a friend you've had for a long time, you know that you probably know their intentions, but you want to assume the best. And if they did hurt you, acknowledge the hurt. Let them know that they hurt you. Don't let it fester. Don't let it kind of get awkward between you and you don't talk to them anymore. And if you are going to forgive someone and have that conflict resolution, it probably needs to be face to face. You also need to practice apologizing. If someone says that they've been
Folks, it looks like we might be having some technological difficulties. I don't know what's happening outside your window, but here we're having terrible windstorms. So Desiree, I don't know if you can still hear us, but you have frozen on us. Let's give this just a minute and see if she can return to the screen. Sarah, it looks like we may have lost Desiree. Is that the case?
Yes, it does look like her Zoom dropped. So I would say let's give her a couple of minutes and hope she can come back. I'll try to find her contact information and get in touch.
And while we wait maybe for that to happen, we were nearing the end of her presentation. So one of the things that we do at the end of each one of these mental health seminars is allow individuals to ask questions of our presenter. So in anticipation that Desiree is going to come back to us, if you have particular questions, if you would drop those into consider dropping those into the Q&A now, and we'll hope that she'll return here in just a moment and we'll be able to benefit from her wisdom and expertise. Folks, again, hopefully we aren't frozen for you, but our speaker, it looks like, was having some technological difficulties. I know it is stormy in various parts of the region, and it looks like she froze and then we lost her. So Sarah, I think we'll give our speaker Desiree Griffin just maybe 1 or 2 more minutes to come back. Oh, she's returning to audio. Desiree, if you can hear us, we hung in just a little bit in hopes that you might be able to return.
I did. Our power went out, so I'm on my laptop now, and power came back on, but computer shut down completely. So I'm gonna see if I can. I can't. Let's see if I can start my video for y'all. There we go. All right. So come different angle because on my laptop now, but let me see if I can share my screen, and I will wrap up quickly with you guys.
I'm
Thanks
so
for
sorry to
bearing with.
hear about the power. Hopefully everybody stays safe.
Oh, yeah, I think it must have been the wind because it's not even raining here. So
Okay.
we'll wrap up really quickly. I'll just go back to depth and then we'll wrap up. Okay, so can everyone see my screen where we were?
Yes.
All right, great. Thanks for hanging in there with me, y'all. Okay, so again, practice forgiveness, practice apologizing. And a big one is avoid gossip. Especially if you're in a group of friends, it can be really easy to gossip to your other friends about that friend who's also in your group. You're not going to create a space of intimacy or safety if that's happening. People aren't going to want to come to you if they know that you might gossip about what you do because you gossiped about someone else. All right. And then the last two, service and values, I'll kind of go through those quickly. These can really help us feel connected to other people, and it really forces us to put other people's needs first if we serve others. Part of a good friendship is serving that friend and not just wanting to be served all the time. So anticipate your friends' needs, show up for your friends. One of the things I found in the Surgeon General's advisory was that there's actually a virtuous cycle between social connection and volunteerism, such that the more you volunteer, the more connected you feel, and the more connected you feel, the more likely you are to volunteer. So volunteerism is a great way to kind of feel connected to your community, and it just provides that sense of shared purpose. And then finally, values. This is where you really want to reflect your values and join things where your values can come out. It does provide that sense of shared purpose with your community. But also, one of the best things that can help you grow when you have friendships with people who have shared values as you. It really is a way for iron to sharpen iron. It's when you have those trusted voices who have those shared values, who can speak to you, kind of provide you feedback to help you grow in a loving way. And reflect those values for connection into your interactions. Like if that's an important value for you, reflect that back in how you interact with people by how you divvy up your time, how you listen, how you show concern, things like that. Practice gratitude. Typically, when you come from a space of positivity, other people will gravitate towards you naturally as well. Positivity begets positivity. And then seek diversity. Although we might like people with shared values, one of the ways that you can appreciate other values in your community is to seek those out as well. So that is all I have for you. I was going to ask you to, and I'll just have you keep this in mind, 'cause I know we're low on time. Just think of what's one concrete thing you can do, whether it be what you do with your time, whether it be what you do with going deep, but what's something you can do in the next week that might deepen your connections. But I will go ahead and turn it over back to y'all for the little time we have left. But again, thanks for hanging in there with me.
Oh my goodness. Thank you, Desiree, for thinking quickly and getting back on screen for us. We were
Absolutely.
I was so enjoying the presentation, and I know I speak for everybody when I'm saying we're glad you're back because I anticipate there are a lot of folks who may have questions. So
Okay.
again, crew, this is the opportunity to go into the Q&A section if you would and ask any questions. This way everybody can see the question, folks can upvote it, we can document whether it's asked and answered. So now is the opportunity to interact and ask Desiree all those burning questions you have. Desiree, I have to tell you a couple of things. When you were talking about ways to get engaged, particularly when we were discussing students, I had written student organization in my notes, and then you came to it, and that was wonderful. But as I was thinking, as somebody who obviously works in student affairs and facilitates student development, a campus job is a great way to get connected. And you talked about
Yes.
colleagues and connecting. Think of club sports, think of joining a recreation class, whether or not that's, Pilates or aerobics or, Zumba or whatever sort of appeals to you. These
A
ways
lot
to
of
sort of get to
students in that
interact.
survey said that club sports was one of the ways they got really connected, or like one person said marching band, one person said their
Yes,
a cappella group. And so again, it's finding a group that you're not just joining a group to join a group, you're joining a group of an activity you love, a hobby you love, because if you do the things you love, you're going to find people that probably have similar interests as you, and that's just a faster way to connect, an easier way to connect when you're joining a group that kind of reflects your values and your interests.
agreed. And I'm, so grateful for you mentioning so many of those things. And it's one of the issues that I often talk with students and colleagues too about this wonderful about being a part of a higher education community, whether you're a student or a faculty and staff member, is that these communities have sort of built-in ways to connect and engage often, which other connections that you may have may not offer in quite the same way. So take advantage of these opportunities. And
Absolutely.
again, our shared identity as Tar Heels. I think that's wonderful.
One
Well,
thing I didn't really have a chance to really highlight that I'll just kind of highlight here is we like that fear of rejection really stood out as being like the biggest barrier for people feeling connected. And I would say take that, like if you have that insight about yourself, try to grow in that area. Maybe before you go out and you try to make all these good friends, maybe practice skills that can help you practice failure. It doesn't have to be with friends, but maybe it's, you accept an invitation somewhere. Maybe you do wait for an invitation to come to you, but maybe working on that. And it's also not uncommon if you have high anxiety. Maybe that's something you can work on in a more dedicated space that's related to mental health, to maybe practice some social skills to kind of help you with some assertiveness, to maybe not take things so personally, and to, again, assume the best. There's this thing called the liking gap, and people have a much lower rate of how they think people like them than it actually is. And so there's this advice given that go in assuming people will like you. And that might help just relieve some of that pressure or fear of rejection, because people tend to really underestimate how much people like them.
appreciate that so much. As we're waiting for some questions to come in, I have a couple of things that we often like to ask our facilitators. So, one, I'm curious to know, you gave us some really valuable background about yourself. Talk a little bit more, if you would, about how you hit upon psychology as your career field. And in particular, if there are colleagues out there or students out there who think, I might be very interested in this as a possible career path for myself. Are there any particular channels that you might recommend? I mean, aside from obviously taking courses and so forth, but any particular things that perhaps you pursued that really helped you distill, I think this is what I want to do.
Yeah. So again, my area is forensic psychology, and I loved true crime stories. Probably like back in my day, that it's like the equivalent of a true crime podcast right now. I would read those. And so that kind of drew me to that side of psychology. And I also had a couple of lucky happenstance things happen. I went to an undergrad where the forensic psychology graduate program was really prominent. So it filtered into my undergrad experiences. And so I got exposed to my different interests in forensic psychology through a research lab. I would say though that if you're interested in clinical psychology, that one of the best things you can do is talk to as many people about it, whether it be faculty or not, because psychology especially is so different than what people assume it is. Like even in clinical psychology, there's so many different things you can do with that people don't assume you can do. I bring in guest speakers into my clinical psych class to highlight all the different types of jobs you can have as a clinical psychologist. It's not just sitting in a therapy chair doing therapy. Like I do evaluations of prisoners, and I work for the court. I've worked in a prison, whereas I have a good colleague who works at UNC Hospital, and she does pediatric psychology, where she's mostly working with medical patients to help them process some of their medical conditions. And so there's just lots of different things. So I would say my best advice that helped me was I just talked to as many people as I could who were in the field to really get a sense of where my interests were.
That's very helpful. And you touched upon something else that I was going to ask you about. You were terrific in sharing lots of different resources today that folks might follow up on, and we might steal those from you so that we could put those up on the Heals Care Network site on this
Sure.
particular page. But in particular, are there any things like podcasts that you recommend that you find particularly helpful, or apps that you find particularly helpful if folks want to learn more, want to study more about this particular topic?
So I actually just brought up using a gratitude app with my family the other day because I want to practice gratitude, but sometimes because I'm busy, I don't think about it. But I've sat down to kind of practice gratitude, and I usually get a week into it before I stop doing it. And I think it's because I don't have a ready to go app. So I found an app on gratitude. And so that's one thing you might want to think about. There's so many apps where you can track what you're thinking, and I think tracking gratitude might also help you be more accepting of when you do have times alone. It won't feel like it's because you're rejected. You can choose solitude. And it's not just because of isolation or rejection. And another, like in terms of podcasts, I will say I lean on the true crime side of podcasts. And I also lean on parenting podcasts, which I'm not sure how relevant that is to everyone, but those are my favorite types of podcasts in general.
That's great. Well, again, a connection here. So I'm mindful that we probably have a number of different communities in the room. I'm curious, maybe sort of a two-part question. If you are a student in the room who has listened to this and really has in mind someone that you know, maybe even sort of a casual friend, that you see exhibiting signs of real loneliness and isolation, maybe has even talked to you. Aside from being a good friend and being a social connection, is there a way that we can facilitate and foster that in a colleague? And also for those of us, to your point, who are parents, is there a way that we can facilitate this kind of behavior in our children, particularly very young folks, to start sort of laying some foundation for success skills later on?
So I ran out of time, but my next section of my talk was going to be facilitating connection. And like, if you yourself feel like you already have like good sets of friendships, what can you do to help others who might be feeling lonely? And I think that's so important. So one of the things I'm going to share my screen really quickly to kind of answer that, since I did have, again, my next slide was on facilitating connection. So I think one thing is to normalize how long it takes to feel connected. I think that's one thing you can do, and share your story. Like if you're a junior or a senior, find a freshman in your class and kind of just start developing a peer relationship with them. That way you can kind of help them understand like they're not alone in this transition to Carolina. That's a hard transition to make, to go from high school to college. Or if you have a new colleague that works in your department, maybe be purposeful about taking them under your wing and offering them just some conversation, someone that they can, like a friendly face in the office so they don't feel so alone. And then you can create space. So I would say make sure that you're really intentional about creating that space. A lot of us tend to hoard our friendships and you want to keep your circle closed. I would say have more of a you and not have a close, not have a closed circle. And sometimes circles are not bad, but be open to letting your groups expand and be an inviter. Like, don't be afraid to invite other people. Yeah. And then I would say just make it a rhythm of talking in your spaces. Like if you have meetings, like maybe make it a point where if you start a meeting, like a faculty meeting, maybe let the first 5 minutes be turning to the person next to them, just kind of catching up on what they've been doing in the department for the last month. But like make that a rhythm of that so people expect it and it doesn't feel so frightening if they know to expect it. And then the last thing I'll say is we had a college student here at UNC several years ago who did pass away in 2019, but her name was Wynn Burris, and she was known across campus for just how giving she was and how inviting she was to other students. And some of the things that people noted about her that made that she did to make them feel welcome and not lonely. She even had a famous quote, "Have fun and look out for the lonely people." But she left notes for people, just small notes. Like she just left notes all the time. So like say, "I'm thinking of you. Good luck on your exam." She celebrated their victories, like, "Hey, congratulations. I heard you made an A on this exam," or "Congratulations on that paper you just got published." Be interested in what other people are interested in too, and don't just make it all about yourself. So I just thought I would share those quick things that you can do to maybe help someone else not feel as lonely if you yourself are feeling like you're in a good place.
That's wonderful. And folks, I promise you that we did not rehearse that. That was not planned.
No,
I love it when I ask a question. She's,
it was
well, allow me to
perfect.
just pull up a page. That's fantastic. Really, really helpful. Okay, we do have a couple of questions in the Q&A that I want to make sure we get answered. So
Yeah.
I like this one a lot. So one person says, what's your biggest takeaway from this session that you want students or anyone really to remember? So if folks walk away from this particular event and think of one thing about it, what do you want to stick with folks?
One thing I would say is don't be afraid to go deep. I think that's where so many of our connections stop. I think people are really good at having superficial connections, and maybe they might feel like they have connections because they might have a lot of friends, those casual acquaintances, but that's not going to be where you get that need for connection and belonging. So I would say don't be afraid to go deep and really push yourself to go deep, even if you feel uncomfortable.
Great, go deep. Another question is, what's your advice for trying to connect with the UNC community when you don't live on campus? And, maybe
That's
I can help out with this one too.
That's a great question. So I feel like if you don't live on campus, one of the things you can do is maybe plan to be on campus, though. I'm not, and everyone has different schedules. Maybe one of the reasons you can't stay on campus is you have a part-time job to get to. I totally get that. But if you feel like you want to make the campus part of your community, then try to stay on campus instead of rushing off campus. Maybe hang out for a couple hours in the library to do your studying instead of studying at your apartment. Maybe making a point to schedule your classes in a way that it forces you to kind of stay for the lunch hour, and maybe see if you can have a weekly lunch date with like a friend or a classmate or something. That might be a way to feel connected. So trying to schedule your classes in a way that allow for those built-in things to happen while you're on campus.
Appreciate that so much. I think that's right, and it strikes me that there is also a sort of running theme through a lot of what we've discussed today, which is making yourself available and establishing habits of doing some of these things.
Yep. It's all about
Establish
rhythm.
a habit of going deep. Establish a habit of gratitude. It becomes easy to get lost in the busy everyday lives we have, but it requires some intentionality and work, particularly if you're somebody, and I share this with you, who tends to be more introverted and doesn't naturally do this.
Yes, it is. And when you find that rhythm, it really helps. So at the beginning of the year, like beginning of the year, in September, the beginning of the academic year, my husband and I had our anniversary trip, and we said one of the things we wanted to focus on was building our connections. And we said we made it a point that we were going to invite this friend in the neighborhood to weekly dinners. And it may not happen every week, right? But if we just know it's going to happen, and now we don't even think about it, it's like, all right, what are we having on Saturday for dinner? And like, it's just become it's just a routine now. So if you can establish those routines, they're more likely to stick, and it's going to take away some of that fear.
Appreciate that so much. All right, last opportunity to ask any questions. I think we have covered both the chat and the Q&A. We are at the very final moments of our presentation today. So first of all, please help me thank Dr. Desiree Griffin for a great program. So grateful for all that you have shared with us and your wisdom and expertise. Here come the applause.
Well, it was my pleasure. Thank you for listening. I appreciate it.
Oh, and thank you again for hanging in. I know we just had our lights flicker here, so I hope everybody stays safe and
Yes.
has power. There is the QR code for those of you who are looking for CLE credit. This is our last mental health seminar of the academic year, but we plan to come back and offer these again next year, particularly as demand permits. So keep an eye again on our Heals Care Network website, which is care.unc.edu. Remember, we have not only events there, but we have our mental health and well-being resource hub that can connect you with all manner of campus resources. We have a host of different services on there as well, a peer chat and some other tools that may be particularly useful for our community. So please check that out, encourage others to access it. Thank you. Big shout out to Sarah Stallman behind the scenes. And thank you everybody for hanging with us today while we navigated some weather drama. But I hope everyone stays safe and has a wonderful rest of the day. Take good care and go Heals.
Thank you. Have a good
Thanks
one.
again, Desiree.